The clan spent weeks on the new, lush savanna, regaining their strength, watching the final remnants of the migration disappear toward the horizon. When they eventually returned, they did so across the dry, sun-baked riverbed, but they carried with them something invisible, a deep-seated understanding of their own species' potential. They learned that the greatest existential threats in life often don't come in the form of a malevolent villain or a stalking predator, but in the shape of blind, indifferent, overwhelming scale. And when brute force and primal instinct fail against such a threat, what separates life from oblivion is the simple, stubborn refusal to accept the boundaries set by nature. This encounter wasn't just a survival story. It was the moment humanity looked at an impossible wall of chaos and decided to build a door. It was the moment that Homo Erectus understood that their purpose was not merely to live in the world, but to find ways to manipulate the world to serve their will. The savanna still stretches vast and indifferent. The dust still rolls, and the migration still thunders across the earth every year. But now, somewhere on the banks of that great river, there is a clan that knows its rhythm, ready to cross again. How many of the challenges you face today are simply a chaotic river waiting for you to build your own ingenious raft? Let us know in the comments below. The greatest immediate reward, however, was the bounty left by the indifferent migration. Scattered across the plain were the broken, exhausted, or injured. The sheer volume of the herd meant that some animals, weaker or simply unlucky, had fallen, giving the clan the resource they had risked everything for. Kael and Tiro, despite their exhaustion, worked swiftly. This was the payoff for their terrifying gamble: meat. The small fire they built that evening was different. It was not a defiant spark against a tidal wave. It was a beacon of survival, a warm, crackling center around which their battered species could gather. As they ate, the raw, visceral taste of victory settled in. The suffering had been immense, the fear absolute, but the triumph was profound. They had endured the spectacle and found the survival waiting on the other side. The Great Migration was not just an event, it was a re-education. The clan of Homo Erectus could never again view their world as a fixed, stable place defined solely by their small, known territory. Their minds, already capable of complex thought, underwent a fundamental, forced shift in perspective. Before the migration, their worldview was essentially two-dimensional: where they were and where the next safe water source lay. After, their world became three-dimensional and temporal. They understood the concept of vast scale, of rhythm, and of overwhelming non-human power. They learned to read the signs long before the dust arrived. They learned to interpret the deep stillness of the air as a warning, and the disappearance of the usual prey as a pre-migration cue. They internalized the knowledge that the world was a vast, moving engine, and that their survival depended not on fighting it, but on anticipating it. This experience, brutal and unfair as it was, fostered the growth of long-term strategic planning. It wasn't enough to plan for the next sunrise. They had to plan for the next season, for the return of the unstoppable river of animals. They had to choose a permanent, strategic location for shelter, a place designed not just for daily safety, but for cyclical mega events. The absurd struggle had birthed foresight. Perhaps the most significant consequence was the solidification of the knowledge embodied in the raft. The hand axe was an extension of the arm, a tool for offense and processing. The raft, built from scavenged, non-food materials, logs and rhino hide, was an extension of the will. It was a portable solution designed to conquer a fundamental geographical barrier: deep, fast-moving water. This wasn't just tool use. It was tool creation for abstract problem solving. It demonstrated an understanding of buoyancy, lashing, and structural integrity, complex cognitive steps far beyond mere adaptation. The rhino hide, initially a disgusting symbol of the river's filth and death, became a prized resource for its waterproofing, a material now associated with freedom and passage. The knowledge of the crossing was passed down, cemented into their collective memory. The Homo Erectus clan had found a way to turn the spectacle of the migration into a resource. They now knew where to wait, how to cross the rivers to track the bounty, and how to utilize the inevitable weakness and deaths that followed the great herd. They went from being terrified victims of the event to becoming the ingenious followers of the pattern. The confrontation with the immense mechanical indifference of the migration had stripped them bare, forcing them to rely only on the one thing no other animal possessed: their capacity for abstract thought under duress. They faced the greatest logistical challenge of their era, an obstacle they could not fight, scare, or eat their way through, and overcame it with 2 logs, some rope made of bark, and a piece of rotting hide. They were no longer just survivors. They were the first engineers. With a final, desperate surge of clarity born from starvation and adrenaline, Kael plunged the hand axe not into an animal, but into a gap between the buffalo's ribs. He drove the point deep, not to kill, but to gain purchase. He pulled his body, then Tiro's, out of the river and onto the slick, wet back of the buffalo. It was insane. They were climbing the chaos. They used the terrified moving bodies of the buffalo and zebra like stepping stones, a living, lethal bridge. They scrambled over the backs, their feet finding brief purchase on bone and muscle, moving with a desperate, primal urgency. The animals beneath them roared and splashed, but the men were too quick, too light, too driven by pure, focused will. They were ghosts traversing a tidal wave. They reached the buffalo that was closest to the bank, a massive, struggling matriarch, and with one final, agonizing heave, they launched themselves free. They tumbled onto the opposite shore, rolling onto dry, solid ground. They lay there, breathless, bruised, bloody, and half-drowned, as the river of life raged behind them. They were utterly, completely safe. Kael rolled onto his back, the sun glaring down, and he coughed up river water and mud. Beside him, Tiro laughed, a thin, reedy sound of pure, shocked relief. They had done it. They had crossed the river. They had survived the spectacle. Kael stood, swaying slightly, and looked back across the river. He was not looking at the migrants. He was looking at the thin, terrifying line of the gorge and the tiny, waiting cluster of his family. The first part of the impossible task was complete. Now he had to go back and get them. Kael stood on the western bank, the blood dried on his face, the tremors of exhaustion running through his limbs. The river of life still flowed, but it had thinned. The relentless, drumming roar of the main herd had receded into a manageable, distant thunder. The impossible had been accomplished. They had crossed the boundary of chaos. But the crossing was only half the victory. The true test lay in turning the fragile, terrifying ingenuity of the raft into a reliable method of rescue. He and Tiro, moving with silent, grim determination, began the slow, agonizing process of ferrying the clan. The sight of Kael, bloody yet resolute, gave the waiting survivors a sliver of hope, a desperate anchor in the mud and dust. Leah, his mate, was the first to cross with the children. Her hands gripped the rhino hide binding with a fierce intensity, her eyes never leaving Kael's. Every crossing was a tense, minute-by-minute gamble against the current, against the few remaining stragglers plunging into the water, and against the lurking shadows beneath the muddy surface. One by one, they were pulled from the jaws of their former sanctuary, which had become a trap. They were weak, skeletal figures, their faces etched with the suffering of weeks without proper nourishment. But as their feet touched the untouched soil of the far bank, the fresh, clean ground where the first herds had already passed, a collective breath seemed to be released. The quiet on the western savanna was deafening. After the relentless, all-consuming noise of the stampede, the silence felt heavy, luxurious. They found clean water trickling from a previously unknown spring, water so cool and clear it seemed like a miracle. A massive crocodile, a relic of an older, fiercer age, burst from the turbid water. It was drawn by the carnage and the weak scent of the struggling animals. It targeted the nearest, easiest prey, the struggling Homo erectus on the clumsy raft. Its jaws snapped shut just centimeters from Tiro's foot. The sound was deafening, a final, lethal declaration in the roar of the river. Panic seized them. Tiro screamed, a raw, primal sound that was instantly swallowed by the churning noise. Kael reacted instantly. He was too exposed for his spear. He grabbed the only weapon he had, the hand axe, their symbol of intellect and craft. He didn't hesitate. As the crocodile surged again, Kael leaped forward, throwing his entire starving weight onto the creature's snout, driving the razor-sharp stone deep into the thick, protective skin around its eye. The crocodile convulsed, thrashing the water into a deadly maelstrom. The raft spun, violently ejecting Kael into the freezing current. He went under, choked on the muddy water, and surfaced just in time to see the colossal reptile sink, defeated, its massive tail whipping the surface. Kael dragged himself back onto the listing raft, gasping, shaking. They had survived the immediate direct threat, but the victory had come at a heavy cost. The struggle had driven them far downstream, pushing them directly into the path of the thickest concentration of crossing migrants. They were no longer crossing a river. They were submerged in a liquid traffic jam of muscle and panic. Wildebeest bodies, wet, heavy, and terrified, slammed into the small raft. A large zebra, its eyes rolling in fear, kicked out violently, its hoof grazing Kael's temple. Blood poured down his face, blinding one eye, but he clung fiercely to the binding ropes. The sheer physical unfairness of the situation was crushing. They had used fire, strategy, and their finest tool to defeat the great beasts of the savanna. Yet here they were, helpless, beaten down by the terrified legs of smaller animals that didn't even know they were fighting. This was not heroism. It was being caught in a mechanical grinder. A gigantic, distressed hippo suddenly breached nearby, angered by the disturbance in its territory. It let out a foghorn roar, a sound of colossal territorial fury. The surrounding animals, already on the brink, surged backward in a new panic wave. The resulting mass of bodies was like a solid wall. The raft was pinned against a cluster of struggling buffalo, an animal even more lethal in its confusion than in its defense. Kael knew this was the end. The pressure was immense, the logs splintering, the rhino hide tearing. The water pressed up, suffocating the makeshift vessel. This was the peak of the absurdity. The Homo erectus, the master of the savanna, was about to be obliterated by a combination of anonymous, terrified hoofstock and an ancient river guardian. Their ingenuity was not enough. In that final, desperate moment, pinned against the buffalo, Kael felt the familiar, comforting smoothness of his hand axe in his grip. It was his last resource. But instead of swinging it at the buffalo, he looked up. He looked past the animal's panicked eyes and saw the far bank, closer now than ever. The buffalo were the anchor, the obstruction, but they were also solid. The next day, as the main wave thinned into straggling groups, Kael stood on the edge of the river, clutching his makeshift creation. A rudimentary, unstable raft of lashed logs and stretched rhino hide. The river was deep, the crossing treacherous, and the straggler animals were the most unpredictable and dangerous of all. Kael had a choice: stay and starve, or face the ultimate chaos and risk everything. He took a deep breath, looked back at the terrified, waiting faces of his clan, and pushed his flimsy vessel into the turbulent water. The fate of the clan, and perhaps the future of all Homo erectus, was now tied to a piece of floating, rotting meat. The stench of the rhino hide raft was a small, immediate threat compared to the chaos of the river. Kael shoved the unstable craft, a clumsy assemblage of bound logs and rough, buoyant leather, into the current. The water, thick with silt and the debris of the million-strong migration, surged instantly against it, threatening to tear apart his desperate ingenuity. This was not a confrontation with a predator. It was a battle against physics and the sheer, overwhelming indifference of nature. Kael and Tiro pushed, their bare feet slipping on the slick mud. The raft bobbed, rotated violently, and nearly capsized before Kael vaulted onto the sodden surface. The world lurched. They paddled with salvaged branches, their muscles screaming from starvation and fear. They were instantly surrounded. The animals that were crossing were not orderly. They were the weakest, the most desperate, or the newly panicked stragglers. They splashed, stumbled, and fought, their massive bodies churning the water into a muddy froth. Kael kept his eyes fixed on the far bank, the promised land of quiet savanna. They had covered half the distance when the true danger, unseen until now, rose from the depths. A ripple, silent and sinister, approached the raft. Then, the water exploded. He took his best young hunter, Tiro, and they crept out of the gorge's shelter, pressing themselves against the hot rock face. The ground shook beneath them. The problem was not a lack of game. There was more meat passing them than they had seen in 10 lifetimes. The problem was selecting a target. The animals were too densely packed. To try to pierce the moving wall was suicide. A single miss, a stumble, and the hunter would be instantly trampled, becoming just another anonymous bump in the torrent. They saw an exhausted wildebeest falter near the edge, its breath ragged, its legs trembling. Kael signaled, and they moved with silent, coiled precision. Just as Kael raised his throwing spear, 3 stronger, healthier beasts surged forward, jostling the weak one. It tumbled, disappeared under a wave of hooves, and was gone. The frustration was immense, bordering on absurdity. They were starving, surrounded by a buffet of food that was simply too dangerous to touch. They watched perfectly good, available sustenance turn to mud right before their eyes, yet they couldn't reach it. The injustice burned. The lack of control was terrifying. Kael realized the sheer scale of the migration was not just a threat, but a prison. They needed to cross the river of animals to get to the quieter, untouched savanna on the other side, where the herds had already passed. He gathered dry grass and wood, their fire, the crowning achievement of their species. The one thing that differentiated them from every other creature was their only hope. Fire repelled most animals. It was a visible sign of human power. Kael and Tiro began building a line of small fires, hoping to create a bright, intimidating barrier along the riverbank. The crackling flames rose, spitting defiance into the dusty air. For a brief, hopeful moment, the stampede hesitated. The first row of wildebeest shied away, snorting, their eyes reflecting the unnatural light. Kael felt a surge of ancient pride. They were stronger than the chaos. But the moment was fleeting. The pressure from the animals behind was relentless. They were not rational creatures making a choice. They were atoms in a vast hydraulic system. The hesitant front line was simply shoved forward by the weight of the millions pushing from the rear. The beasts plunged past the flames, some brushing dangerously close, some knocking the meager piles of wood aside. The fire had no effect. The noise, the dust, the sheer numbers drowned out the terror of the fire. Their most powerful weapon was a mere spark against a flood. Kael watched the flames die, beaten out by the countless hooves. His shoulders slumped. They had thrown their intelligence, their most defining trait, against the blind, unstoppable impulse of instinct, and instinct had won. Weeks passed, or perhaps it was only days. Time blurred into a monotonous hell of dust and drumming. They ate roots, gnawed scraps of hide, and watched the life drain from the faces of the children. The clan was weak, demoralized, and staring at certain starvation. Kael knew the flow was thinning, but waiting was no longer an option. The life of his mate, Leah, and his son depended on a desperate gamble. He looked at the churning riverbank, then at the meager pile of dry reeds they had salvaged. He pointed toward the river, still lethal, still moving, and then at the tallest tree remaining on their side. He began to strip bark, not for fire, but for binding. Leah looked at him, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. He was not preparing a weapon. He was preparing something else, something utterly new. He looked at the flowing water, the moving animals, and then at the massive, empty carcass of a rhinoceros that had died crossing the gorge. The air was thick with decay, yet Kael saw not death, but opportunity. He began hacking at the tough, heavy hide of the rhino, working with a frantic, desperate energy. He wasn't building a weapon or a shelter. He was building a way across. The clan's water source, the gentle, life-giving stream, was instantly transformed into a churned, muddy trench. The animals drank, defecated, and died in it indiscriminately. Kael watched in stunned horror as their most vital resource was rendered utterly toxic in a matter of minutes. His frustration was a tight, burning knot in his chest. It was not a fight he could win because there was no antagonist, only an indifferent, overwhelming force of nature. They were trapped. The mass flowed past the mouth of the gorge like an artery cut open, relentless and impossible to cross. The hours bled into one long, agonizing wait, punctuated by the frantic sounds of the stampede. A hunt turned absurd. Hunger, the constant companion of early humans, sharpened into a genuine threat. The small food stores they had were quickly depleted. Kael knew he had to hunt. But how do you hunt when the entire landscape is moving? The migrating creatures, wildebeest, zebra, gazelle, came into focus. Not a herd, but a brown, black, and striped river of flesh, spilling over the savanna. They were driven by an ancient, blind imperative, the call of distant water and fresh grazing. They did not see the small band of Erectus. They merely absorbed them into the landscape of their destination. The loss of sanctuary. Kael's initial plan had been simple: shelter in the gorge, wait for the spectacle to pass. The gorge was their fortress, their source of safety. But the migrants did not respect sanctuary. The sheer mass of the animals acted like a living landslide. They funneled toward the familiar, winding river, and their momentum carried them straight over the edges of the gorge, breaking the familiar brush, tearing down the protective thorn bushes that had marked the clan's boundary for generations. Where the river narrowed, the pressure became unbearable. The migrants didn't slow. They stampeded, driven by the press from behind. It arrived first, not in a gentle cloud, but a suffocating, gritty blanket that rolled ahead of the spectacle, turning the brilliant East African midday into a choking ochre twilight. Kael, standing rigid on the lookout stone, felt the grit coat his lungs and sting his eyes. He shielded his infant son, held tight by his mate Leah, and ordered the clan back into the protective cleft of the gorge. They moved with the frantic urgency of creatures that knew a great, unquantifiable danger was imminent. The smell came next. It was immense, a primal stink of churned earth, hot dung, rank sweat, and the sharp, coppery tang of raw power. It was the smell of millions of living bodies moving as one. It was dizzying, overwhelming, erasing all the familiar markers, the scent of the river, the subtle trail of a hunting cat. Kael's senses, honed over a lifetime of tracking, were suddenly useless, drowned in the sheer volume of this foreign, organic pollution. Then, the sound. It started as a deep, resonant hum, felt more in the bones than heard by the ears, a vast, sustained vibration that seemed to issue from the core of the planet itself. As the darkening mass drew closer, the hum sharpened into a relentless, rhythmic roar. The thump, thump, thump of hooves hitting baked earth. Thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then millions, moving in an endless, pulsing wave. It was a noise that negated thought, a mechanical, terrifying rhythm that crushed the silence the Homo Erectus clan had always relied on. For generations, their existence had been defined by a deep, wooded gorge, a rare sanctuary where water trickled year-round. It was their safe harbor, their anchor in the vast, unforgiving landscape. They knew the scents of the trees, the calls of the hidden birds. They believed this small world, bordered by the deep, winding river, was all the world that mattered. Then, the world changed. It began not with sound, but with absence. The small, familiar herds they tracked daily vanished. The birdsong grew muted. A stillness settled over the savanna, an oppressive silence that felt wrong, like the earth holding its breath. Kael, standing atop his usual sentinel rock, felt a prickle of cold dread that had nothing to do with the sun. He scanned the north, the endless, shimmering plains. The winds shifted, bringing not the scent of rain or predator, but a vast organic musk. And then, far, far off, where the haze met the sky, he saw it. Not a cloud, but a darkening of the earth. A rippling, spreading stain that grew larger minute by relentless minute, swallowing the horizon. Kael's mind struggled to categorize this impossible sight. Too fast for a creeping shadow, too wide for a wildfire. It was an entity, a single, colossal movement heading straight for their sanctuary. The fragile balance of the Erectus world was about to be violently tipped. Kael did not know what was coming, but he knew one thing with primal certainty. Whatever it was bigger than the sun, and it was coming to share their water. The quiet was over. The darkening on the horizon was no longer a shadow. It was the dust. Forget everything you thought you knew about early human history. We're diving into a moment so profound, so utterly breathtaking, it shaped our very existence. For a small clan of Homo Erectus, our ancient ancestors, the world was a fragile, brutal balance. Survival meant knowing every shadow, every scent. But then, the horizon began to move. Not a storm, not fire, but a silent, terrifying rumble that promised change on a scale they couldn't comprehend. Imagine standing still as a million beating hearts rush toward you. Witness the epic first encounter between these early humans and the unstoppable, overwhelming force of nature. The Great Migration. This isn't just history, it's a primal clash. Was this moment the beginning of their doom, or the birth of human ingenuity? What happens when the hunter becomes the anomaly in the path of the spectacle? The world belonged to the sun and the dust. This was the East African savanna, millions of years ago, a place of lethal beauty where survival was measured in heartbeats. And here, clinging to a precarious existence, were the makers of fire, the thinkers of simple strategy, the clan of Homo Erectus. Meet Kael. He was not a king, just the strongest hand among his small group of 15. A father, a guardian, a hunter who understood the language of the long grass. His body was a monument to persistence, muscled, built for the tireless walking that defined their species. He held the skill his kind had perfected, the hand axe, a smooth teardrop of stone that was the sharpest tool in this entire epoch. It was their key to meat, their defense against the night. Theirs was a life balanced on a knife edge. Every dawn brought the need to find water before the hyenas, to chase down the swift gazelle without becoming the meal of a stalking cat. They didn't control their world, they merely adapted to it, moving in silent coordination, relying on the warmth of the small, precious fires Kael helped maintain. They were survivors by sheer grit and the revolutionary discovery that standing tall gave them a glimpse over the lethal horizon. Forget everything you thought you knew about early human history. We're diving into a moment so profound, so utterly breathtaking, it shaped our very existence. For a small clan of Homo Erectus, our ancient ancestors, the world was a fragile, brutal balance. Survival meant knowing every shadow, every scent. But then, the horizon began to move. Not a storm, not fire, but a silent, terrifying rumble that promised change on a scale they couldn't comprehend. Imagine standing still as a million beating hearts rush toward you. Witness the epic first encounter between these early humans and the unstoppable, overwhelming force of nature. The Great Migration. This isn't just history, it's a primal clash. Was this moment the beginning of their doom, or the birth of human ingenuity? What happens when the hunter becomes the anomaly in the path of the spectacle? The world belonged to the sun and the dust. This was the East African savanna, millions of years ago, a place of lethal beauty where survival was measured in heartbeats. And here, clinging to a precarious existence, were the makers of fire, the thinkers of simple strategy, the clan of Homo Erectus. Meet Kael. He was not a king, just the strongest hand among his small group of 15. A father, a guardian, a hunter who understood the language of the long grass. His body was a monument to persistence, muscled, built for the tireless walking that defined their species.